Okay, so today I'm going to go over the formulas and settings required to make this trade simulator work. So hopefully with that you'll be able to make your own simulator and start testing out your systems. Okay, so the first setting that we need to enable is iterative calculation. So you go to your File tab, to Options, Formulas, and here you can see I've got iterative calculation enabled. That's going to allow you to do some circular referencing, which you need to be able to do. And then the second formula, most important, is the rand between function. That's going to allow you to generate random numbers between a specified range. So here I've got 0 to 1,000. That simply references my market setting value, and in our price change column you see it here as being multiplied by 10. So 51 times 10 gets us a value of 510, and that's our threshold for whether or not the signal is up or down. I've got another rand between function over here that randomizes the amount of the movement. So the stock goes up or down by random increments. You can see that in the column here. So in terms of our pricing and our virtual stop, that's all pretty straightforward, basic Excel formulas. I'm not going to get too much into that. You can certainly make this cleaner than this formula here, but that's not really important. So we'll just skip ahead to our output value here, which simply takes the first value in this column. So every time I get stopped out, that gets signaled by a 1 in this column, and then it'll tell me that I'm stopped out in this column, and the profit or loss of the trade, and then I just have it put up in this cell here so that it's easy to reference into our counter table here. So again, this is probably a lot more complicated than it needs to be. I've got the index and the match function going on here, which just reads this column for the specified range and spits out the first value in the column. Okay. Now, finally, we need to be able to record this value every time it changes, and this is where you need your iterative calculations enabled, because every time we recalculate this sheet by pressing F9, it's going to run the trade again, and that value is going to change. You can see it changing as I'm recalculating. So what we want to be able to do is add every value into a new line in this table and then total the results. Alright, so here is our counter table in a simplified version, just so I can show you a little easier how it's constructed and how it works. Again, so firstly we want to make sure that we have iterative calculations enabled. So you can see I've got that checked off here, and we need to set our maximum iterations to 1. Okay, so here's our table where we're going to be recording our new values every time we get a new input value. And so here's our input value. This is the value that's going to change every time we recalculate the sheet, and we just need to be able to record it in a new row in the table. So I've created 3 items up here. The first one is our value, which is just a simple reflection of the input value. And then secondly, we have our counter, which is just counting the number of times we recalculate the sheet and get a new value. And then our reset button, which is essentially just an on-off switch for the table. That lets us turn it on and begin recording, and then turn it off and reset the values to nothing. So you can see I've got it set to 1, which turns it off, and it's giving us all blank values. If we turn it to 0 and begin recording, it's going to fill in our new value every time we recalculate. So for the formulas, there's really only 2 formulas you need to make this work. First one is for our counter. What that's doing is looking at our reset button and seeing if our table is turned on or not. So it's looking at like E5, the reset. If it's anything but 0, it returns a value of -1, which is essentially nothing for our purposes. Otherwise, if our table is turned on and this value is set to 0, then our counter value becomes its previous value plus 1. So this is circular referencing, but it's okay because we've got iterative calculations enabled. And then for our second formula to input the values is, again, it's looking at our reset button and looking for a 0 value. So if it's anything but 0, it returns a blank, which we've got here because our reset is 1. Otherwise, if our reset is 0, and that means our table is turned on, then it's going to look for the value. And then so what this looks at is if the number in our table referring to the number of the calculation or the counter value, if our counter value matches its corresponding value in its line in the table, then it returns the value in our value cell here. Otherwise, it returns its starting value, which in this case was blank, right? So again, it's looking to see if our counter matches the number in the table, and then returns either a blank if it doesn't. So if we're not on calculation 1, then it's not going to return any value to this cell other than its original starting value, which in this case was blank. Otherwise, if it does match, say our counter is 1 and we're on the first row of our table, then it's going to return the value in our value cell here. Alright, so that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to turn the table on and just show you how that works. So the table is on, and you can see that we've got our input value now matches. And then if we do a calculation by pressing F9, it's going to record that value in that cell. And then we can put in a new value, and every time that value changes, it updates our table in a new line. Right? So you can see that this value was on calculation number 2 as counted by our counter, which corresponds to calculation number 2's line in the table, and therefore inputs the value. So that's basically how that works, just using a couple of simple formulas. This guy here to count the number of calculations, and this formula to record them or leave them blank, depending on what is appropriate. So hopefully that makes it simple. In the original generator video, I've got, or in the generator table, I've got these values. You can see them referenced with the $ signs here, these cells. You can also um, define these cells and give them actual names if that's easier. But in this case, I just decided to reference cells so that you could see the formulas a little more clearly.